driven. That's the word Christians use to describe this deep thing inside of us that just is selfish. You can live in a culture that's like goody two-shoes culture, and then you enter it, you'll still want to be selfish because that's what drives you. That's why Hudson is much easier to say, just take that person's spot than, Daddy, why don't we give them our spot? Because that doesn't come naturally. You guys following with me so far? We want to imitate Christ. We want to allow God to live through us, but we're hampered because we're socially conditioned and we say things, we think things, we appreciate things that aren't the way God wants us to do. Now sometimes the behavioral conditioning is fine. Like for example, when you go to the bank and you don't want to engage in a conversation with the people around you, you don't want the clerk or the teller to ask you about your kids, because you want to do the banking thing by memory. You just want to act it out so that while you're doing the banking thing, you're thinking about dinner, you're thinking about a problem at work that you need to solve. You don't want to be interrupted because when you have some scripts, they're helpful. You know, they save mental energy. When you go to a restaurant, you just want to put your name on the list, they call your name, you sit down, you look at a menu, you order your food, you eat it, then you get the bill, then you pay for it, then you tip the waitress, and you go home. You don't want to go to a restaurant where you have to go wash your own plates, you eat the food, you pay first, and then you get the food, and they mix up the order. You'd be like, oh, which do I do next? Which way is next? I'm confused. You would never go back to that restaurant. You want to follow the patterns you've always followed because that frees up your mental energy to do other things. But the problem is when those behavioral patterns get in the way of what God wants to do. When they keep us from seeing more of God in our lives. And they blind us, which we hinted at last week in the verse we read about the God of this world blinding believers. These behavioral patterns blind us so we think that's the best way to live. So all of that is intro to where we're going today, which is A. We want God to shine through us. We're on the same page? Okay. B. We do that by imitating Christ. Okay, we're on the same page. We want to be Jesus impersonators. Problem, we're hampered by our social conditioning and our fleshly desires and our behavioral scripts. We don't always know the right thing to do when we don't have the power ever to accomplish them. We'd rather imitate the resurrection than the crucifixion. Now we can open up our text and we're going to see what Paul says, because the whole book of 2 Corinthians is on this topic. And here's where we're going to go with this text. We're going to see that to imitate Jesus, to be a Jesus impersonator, we must recognize our weakness, recognize our suffering, and allow God to empower us to overcome our weakness, and therefore God is glorified. To put it another way, instead of complaining about our suffering, we delight. We're happy. We know there's something good going to come. We delight in our weakness because it is God's greatest opportunity to glorify His Son through you in your weakness. Just before we hit the text, I made a list of 6 types of weakness, 6 types of suffering, and what I'm going to talk about kind of relates to them all. Sometimes we suffer just from everyday inconveniences. Like how many times this week have you said, it's too hot? The heat is just an inconvenience that makes us suffer. Traffic makes us suffer. Our kids make us suffer. We're weak in all those moments. We're weak and we're prone to complaining and getting mad. Everyday inconveniences. Then there's the suffering that's your own fault. You reacted in anger. You procrastinated. Now you have to deal with it. You reacted in anger. Now there's a conflict you have to deal with. Your fault, your suffering, your weakness. Third one, sometimes being good, you suffer. You be honest on your taxes, you have to pay more money usually. You be good, you suffer. You refuse to lie to the customer, you don't make the sale, and your manager fires you because you refuse to lie about the product that's so good that wasn't that good. Fourth one, sometimes, a lot of times, when you say no to sin, you suffer. If I say no to procrastinating, it means I got to get off my butt and work. I suffer by working. If I say no to apologizing, I suffer because a relationship is torn. So we say no to sin, we suffer. We put others first, we suffer. I gave up the parking spot, not because I'm so inherently good, but because I let God empower this new behavioral script. I suffered for a minute. I didn't get the spot. I had to wait 5 minutes for this other spot. By denying ourselves, putting others first, we suffer. And sixthly, sometimes by being a leader, by putting yourself up front, saying, follow me, I'm the first one in the pool, you guys, let's go. As a leader, you suffer. And that's where Paul's coming from. Well, what he's going to talk about relates to all those other 5 types of suffering that you all experience, the weakness and suffering you all experience. So the background of this text is, as I mentioned last week, the people in Corinth, the believers in Corinth, were rejecting Paul as their leader because the other leaders were coming in and saying, don't follow Paul, he's not that impressive. He's got a physical problem. We don't know what it was. Maybe it was a deformity or kind of a rash or maybe even a bad smell, some people think, or epilepsy. They go, he's not that impressive physically. He doesn't speak very passionately. And he doesn't brag about going in like the holy ecstatic zone and having religious experiences. He doesn't talk about that stuff. He's not super rich. He's not taking money from you like we are. We're rich. We got awesome charismatic experiences to brag to you about. We speak very eloquently. And we look good. We dress good. So the new leaders were saying stuff like that. And so they're starting to reject Paul. And so he comes at them this entire book of 2 Corinthians saying, you reject me, you're rejecting the gospel. You reject me, you're rejecting Jesus. I'm the new Moses. I have the truth about Jesus. These other guys don't. And then he says, I could boast about all my stuff, but I'm not going to. I'm going to boast about something else. That's where we're going today. So chapter 4, verse 7. We'll go to chapter 12 in a little bit. Chapter 4, verse 7. So he's continuing his argument that God is glorified through us in our weakness as we imitate the death of Jesus, as we suffer in our weakness. Verse 7. But we have this treasure. The treasure is reflecting God, glorifying God, seeing God do mighty things through our lives. We have that. It's no longer luminescent. It's now life change and our words. We have this treasure in jars of clay. Jars of clay are kind of fragile. They're cheap. They're us. We're broken. We have them in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God, not from us. So in our weakness, while we're suffering, we do what's right. Empowered by God, He gets all the credit. Because we're fragile, weak, broken things. And here's how we imitate Jesus. Verse 8. We're hard-pressed. That's death on every side, but not crushed. That's resurrection. We're perplexed. That's death, but not in despair. That's resurrection. Verse 9. We're persecuted. That's death, but not abandoned. That's resurrection. We're struck down. Death, but not destroyed. Resurrection. Verse 10. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. We suffer, we're weak. We're imitating the death of Jesus when He was suffering and weak. So that the life, the resurrection of Jesus may be revealed in our body. You can't have resurrection without death. For we who are alive, we got jars of clay, broken little fragile things that are just shining the glory of Jesus because we've allowed His grace to empower us in those weak times. Us, those of us who are alive, are always being given over to death. We always suffer, we're always weak. Happens to you guys on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, even right now. But you're not. We're alive. We're always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that His life may be revealed in our mortal bodies. That's the pattern. Verse 12. So then, death is at work in us. We suffer, we're weak, but life is at work in you. What he's saying is, I'm the leader. I'm suffering for being a leader. He says, you're making fun of me. These other guys are putting me down. I've been beat up, tossed around, insulted, near death. Like, I've had a